So I'm Sian, and I'm here to talk about tips and tricks with Jupyter Notebooks. Don't know if that's in the way. I've started as today's actually been my first day as a junior DevOps engineer with Tech Amigos. Tech Amigos architect and deliver on solutions for data and DevOps pipelines for focused projects. Okay, so Oscar's covered some of this. So I'm a data analytics professional with 4 years commercial experience, and I'm now entering a kind of DevOps space. So my previous roles as a data engineer and analyst with Signal in Brighton. So I've been programming with Python since 2018, and I have 3 rabbits. This is just a little family of rabbits adopted before lockdown in February. Okay, so I'll be covering a quick intro to Jupyter Notebooks. We'll be looking at virtual environments, which are my favorite, package management, publishing your own resources, which you'll see is actually really practical, and creating your own interactive dashboards, and we'll finish up with a demo. Okay, so Jupyter Notebooks are notebooks which work in the browser as a client-server application. It spun from IPython in 2014 as part of Project Jupyter. Jupyter Notebooks are part of the Anaconda ecosystem, which is open source. When you start up Anaconda, Jupyter Notebooks will be one of the first things you see. So here's just a little screenshot of a Jupyter Notebook. And you have cells where you can run code or you can put markdown. So this is just an example of markdown for a title, producing just hello world here. And then this is just an example of code, which ends up printing hello world in an output cell. So we have input cells and output cells. That becomes quite important later. Okay, so with Jupyter Notebooks, you actually have these configured with a kernel. Typically, there's a lot of support for this with Python, but other programming languages are supported for this, like Julia R, I think Fortran as well, examples. And then if we think of use cases, they're great for iterative development. For instance, when you are building your machine learning model, it's easy to tweak parameters. They're great for some general R&D, so you can produce some data visualizations with some libraries, and then you can note your insights using Markdown below that, if you so wish. I'm going to show you that they're great for creating teaching resources and ultimately storytelling. So just some quick tips. So I say think methodically, and I'd stick to executing cells in order if you can, because otherwise you're going to lose track of where you've actually assigned data to variables. And I'd say, if in doubt, run all cells so you avoid hitting your head against the wall. Not suitable for beginners. So I'd say a good starting point would be to work with something like PyCharm, where you can get used to running your code end to end and get used to the process of debugging and using print statements. Because in my opinion, Jupyter Notebooks kind of bypass that need to actually print variables. So you might get into some bad habits earlier on. Okay, so this is just a quick intro to virtual environments before we really deep dive into things, and I don't want things to get too complicated. So virtual environments help compartmentalize libraries for projects, and if you find that you're using similar libraries across projects, you might consider using the same virtual environment. So if we think of a typical data science project, you'd be looking to use like your pandas and NumPy, So pandas for data frames, which is like Excel for Python with tables. For data visualization, the typical go-tos are matplotlib, Seaborn, which I think is a bit more fancier for some things, like for pair plots. And also Plotly introduces some interactivity, which we'll see later on. And if you are going to do a portfolio piece and push that to GitHub, I would say do remember to include a requirements.txt file, because if someone pulls down your notebook, they need to know what requirements need to be installed. Okay, so this presentation is going to be shared on the Silicon Brighton website in the data forum section. So you'll be able to access these resources that I've produced. Without further ado. Okay, so can everyone see my browser?
Yeah.
Yeah, great, yeah. Thank you. Okay, so first part, we'll cover setting up virtual environments for the Python kernel. So to start with, let's imagine that you have started up Jupyter Notebook, you've got your new notebook ready, and we want to configure that with a kernel. So in the command line, what you would need to do is use this command with conda create. This will be the name of your virtual environment. It's quite handy to put the Python version within that as well. So I've specified, for instance, for this one, Python 3.8. You can be more specific about that as well, like 3.8.2 if you like. And the really useful command is this one here, which actually helps us understand what virtual environments have already been set up, and also to see that you've actually created this environment in the first place. So we need the virtual environment set up first in order to actually set up a kernel which can be browsed for within the Jupyter Notebook. So you'll see what I mean as we go down. So once we've set up the virtual environment, we can activate that in the command line. Okay, so this shows it's activated, and the equivalent to pip freeze with conda is conda list. Okay, so when I set up a virtual environment, even with PyCharm, the things that I would be checking for primarily are pip, setup tools, and wheels. And then because we're using conda, conda actually integrates pip, and it actually includes the Python interpreter. Okay, you won't get that typically. So it's just a good point to remember, and we can check through using this the version which has been set up for this as well. So I didn't specify 3.8.5, but that seems to be the one which was pulled down for this particular environment, so it's always good to check. Okay, so next step is, in order to get that kernel, we need to do conda install ipykernel. There's a few steps here. I know this is a little bit heavy going, but this will be shared. Okay, so then we're back to our Jupyter Notebook that we've set up, and you'll be able to go kernel, change kernel, and by default, there'll always be this Python 3 one, but you should be able to see other kernels that you've set up. And after you've finished using your virtual environment and you've installed packages and whatnot, you can go conda deactivate. Okay, so now we're going to move on to package management. Okay, so a really nice little feature I discovered in Anaconda was from the menu, just under home, there is a section called environments, and you can actually browse the kernels which have been set up. You can actually see the packages which are installed under that environment, and in addition to conda list, we actually can see a description for what some of these modules are, which is really helpful, because it's like, oh, okay, I've installed ipykernel, but you know, what is it? what else has been installed at the same time. Okay, so there are some issues we can get with interdependencies, which I'll be covering. So I've gone over, typically we'll be using conda. So we can do conda install, for instance, matplotlib. You can do pip install, but then pip's installed within conda, okay? So you don't really need to worry about that. Now there's this thing called channels. Let's scroll down here. You can, if you end up using conda, but you also use this channel called conda forge, you'll end up seeing this when you run conda list as well. Okay, so conda forge is a community-led initiative for providing builds for the conda package manager. And in this example is matplotlib. If I just use conda install matplotlib, I get this version, which is pretty recent. If I do conda forge, I actually get a later version. And what I've typically found is conda forge will pull the latest version, kind of irrespective of the Python version that you're working with. So you will get notifications say, okay, you're going to install this module, but it also may show a more up-to-date Python module. So in this test environment, I started with 3.8.5, and after using conda forge to get matplotlib, what happens through agreeing to this upgrade is that I actually end up with Python 3.8.6 in my virtual environment, and that's really not ideal because it can end up meaning that we get problems with the kernel, and it's kind of hard to fix that. So I would say don't worry so much about using conda forge, stick to just using conda install and then install what you need to. Be consistent in how you use that. Okay, so then here are just some basic commands for if you want to output a requirements.txt file, this is what you can use. And then here's some directions for, say you've pulled down your GitHub project with the Jupyter Notebooks or projects in general, you can just run this command to install the requirements. Okay. So the next bit is probably a bit less complicated and fun. Okay, so publishing your own resources. So you can prepare Jupyter Notebooks in a way so that they can be exported as static HTML files. Okay, so you can consider a solution where you can hide all the coded inputs, but you can keep the outputs that you wish to show. And any code that you want to show can be written in Markdown with and encapsulated with backticks here. Okay, and then in the last cell of your notebook, you can paste this code, which helps hide coded inputs. So I'm going to show a screenshot now so you actually can understand what I mean. Okay, so here I've just got some cells that I'm pointing out with some markdown. Okay, here. Then we've got some coded cells. Okay, and then that's that code which you can paste at the bottom. It's not marked down. And when we run that on the right hand side, this renders this image, but that code is hidden. Okay, and then this section here is as a result of the markdown code, markdown written code, but not from this. Okay, and then this is the data frame which is produced as a result of this, and what you end up with is a report which looks quite smart. Okay, so once you're happy with producing your report, you can download that as a static HTML file, and then you can deploy that to GitHub. And this is what I've actually done to produce these resources. So we can take, like, if I highlight in the browser, the URL for the project, and then you can put this as a prerequisite to that. So I'll just quickly show another example in another tab, another project I had. So yeah, and I wanted to show this one because of, okay, this project has data frames, and there's still an element of interactivity because I can scroll on some of the data frames. Okay. So now I'm going to go on to creating interactive dashboards. Okay, so creating interactive dashboards in Jupyter Notebooks can be quite a long and complicated process. I've been there. And then they can't be exported as static HTML files. Okay. So top tip for this is understand your requirements for the dashboard that you have in mind. If you want to produce some visualizations which doesn't require so much data manipulation, then I would actually recommend using something like Power BI or Tableau. Ultimately, that would use less coding. And I would say there's a lot of technologies out there, and you might want to consider some cloud solutions. So I actually came across a really good article which evaluated some cloud notebook tools, and here's some considerations from that to think about. So what languages are supported by the notebooks? Do they facilitate the need to install packages? How's the interface similar to just using Jupyter Notebooks? Can you share publicly? Can you collaborate in the same environment online? Because that's really handy within business, right? So some of you may have already heard of Kaggle, and there's some other notebook tools like Google Colab and Microsoft Azure Notebooks, and Databricks is becoming more of a buzzword, something nice to explore. So I've also put here as an additional thing, you might consider a solution where you can have a Jupyter Notebook instance hosted on a AWS EC2 virtual machine. Okay. And so these are some typical libraries that you might have for your Jupyter dashboards. So I think I mentioned some of these earlier. Okay, and then you'd want to include widgets for more interactivity, so IPy widgets for drop-downs and sliders. Okay, so now I'm going to show just some screenshots briefly before I actually show the actual interactive dashboards, so you understand a bit about what we're looking at. So I've got some Google Analytics web traffic data, which I fed into a interactive dashboard in Jupyter, which is active within a running kernel. Okay, so what I've got here for section A is a data visualization for a linear regression model for users versus page views and sessions. In reality, that would be, they're not independent variables, so you wouldn't use this particular data, but this is just for illustrative purposes. And then I've just got this feature where, for instance, you can enter a number of users, press submit, and then it will put sessions, expected sessions and page views in relation to that. And then this section includes a quadrant. It is actually to scale in the actual dashboard, where this would use Plotly. You can scroll for your key metric and your year as well. So without further ado, we will switch to the notebook. So we are now in Jupyter Notebook. I am going to restart and run all. So if you produce your dashboard like I have done, it will look a bit funny when you come into it. So going to run all the cells. This is some of the code which is behind it. It's a lot of code and it will give you a headache. And that should be running. Okay. So I'll demo it so you get an idea of the kind of transitions. So I'll do that again. It's not the neatest thing in the world compared to some other tools. But yeah, this is just to show some capabilities of what you can do. Go like this. So a little flaw with this is I haven't got this information going to a widget. It's actually going to the output cell in the notebook. So it should really override this, but it doesn't. And it was just hard for me to update the code because I did it a little while ago. But I thought it's also good to just demo that. Okay. So I can toggle between years. And if I just show, so I've got my metrics here. And on hover, you can get some information thanks to Plotly. So this is all in the same kind of grid. Okay. I'll just show a couple of things. The data is not so important in this case, it's just to show you what you can actually do with this. So for average session duration, like the bottom quadrant wasn't actually applicable to it, so it was hidden. Okay, so I think I'm done with this, and I'm happy to go to questions.